This is a revision presentation on crowding out. Firstly, I want to make clear when you would use the idea of crowding out, and it's pretty much only in essays about government borrowing or where government borrowing plays a part. So firstly, the most common way you're going to use it is when you've developed a causal chain where something, through increasing the budget deficit, then has an impact on aggregate demand, and then you might develop from aggregate demand to, for example, to economic growth. And you're then going to use it as a valuation. It's a reason why that causal chain might not operate as you think, and I'll take you through an example of that in a second. You could also do it as a causal chain on its own if you were perhaps writing an essay about consequences of a government running a budget deficit. Something like this 25-mark question from a few years ago on government borrowing would be where it'd be quite appropriate to use crowding out as a piece of analysis in its own right, as one of your body paragraphs. You might then wonder, okay, well, what's my evaluation then of crowding out? And it's quite useful at that point to use the idea of the liquidity trap. The liquidity trap is quite a complicated idea. I suggest that if you want to look over that, have a look through your notes or come and see me and ask about it, and we can talk through it. But it's quite a complex idea, and I think one that most candidates won't or shouldn't be looking to use as part of Econ 4. So how are you going to use this idea as a valuation? Well, if you develop a causal chain to do with government borrowing, so for example reducing income tax, increasing incomes, increasing consumer spending, aggregate demand, and therefore stimulating economic growth, that would form your kind of body paragraph, and of course you'd probably do an aggregate demand shift diagram to go along with that. Your evaluation then might be to say something along the lines of, well, if this is financed through an increase in the budget deficit, then we might get crowding out. And that's the point then when you're going to introduce and deploy the idea of crowding out in order to evaluate that kind of causal chain about connecting the budget deficit to economic growth. There's two approaches if you want to use it. One is to go through it in words, and that's slightly simpler, or you could try and use the kind of bond market supply and demand diagram to illustrate it instead. The verbal explanation goes something like this. You introduce the idea that actually the government and the private sector are competing for loanable funds, for resources with each other. Therefore, if the government runs a budget deficit, which would involve it borrowing more money, less of that money will then be available for the private sector to borrow. But if the private sector can't borrow, then it can't invest, and so we get a fall in investment. And the fall in investment counteracts the increase in aggregate demand that you developed in that original causal chain. And therefore you've developed a reason, an alternative point of view why the causal chain might not operate in the way that you suggested it would. A slightly higher level but more complex way of demonstrating the idea of crowding out would be to use a diagram, specifically a diagram that illustrates the bond market. Now this isn't necessary, but it would demonstrate some really high-level analysis skills that would move you towards the higher levels in an Econ 4 essay. It's really a supply and demand diagram, but in a very particular market. It's the market for borrowing. And the price of borrowing, of course, is the interest rate. We have a normal downward sloping demand curve. The lower the interest rate, the higher the demand for borrowing. The higher the interest rate, the lower the demand for borrowing. The interest rate is the price of borrowing. And then we have an upward sloping supply curve. The higher the interest rate, the more people are willing to lend. The lower the interest rate, the less willing they are to lend. And therefore, as you'd expect, we end up at an equilibrium with an equilibrium interest rate R1 and a quantity of borrowing Q1. What happens then if the government borrows more money? Well, we represent that increase in borrowing, that increase in the budget deficit, for a positive shift in the demand curve. The government is demanding more funds. Now, what's the effect of this increase in government borrowing? Well, it increases the equilibrium interest rate from R1 to R2. Now, do remember, of course, that the government and the private sector are competing for this borrowing. If the government's now offering a higher interest rate, the private sector has to offer a higher interest rate as well. But we know that when interest rates are higher, the private sector is less willing to borrow, and therefore investment will fall. And we come to the same conclusion as in our verbal explanation, that the increase in aggregate demand from the increase in government spending will be balanced out by a reduction in the level of investment. And therefore, again, we're evaluating a causal chain in which government borrowing and aggregate demand are suggested to have a positive relationship.